I'm Briony from UCL, and on behalf of the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Art at UCL, I'd like to welcome you all to this conversation with Phyllida Barlow. I'm going to apologise in advance to those of you who are sitting on the stairs. I hope it's not too hot and uncomfortable, but I think it's a testament to the interest in Phyllida Barlow's work that we have such a great audience this evening. Also, I hope it's not going to be too hot. But I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Phyllida Barlow and also Fiona Bradley, who's the director of the Fruitmarket Gallery in Edinburgh. And we really wanted to set up a fairly informal conversation because a number of reasons, but obviously the most important is that Phyllida has two exhibitions at the moment, two major shows in London. The first being her work doc for the Devine Galleries. That's up until October, and a really interesting intervention into that space at Tate Britain that we would like to engage with seriously. She also has a fantastic exhibition at House Rumworth in Savile Row of 50 years of her drawing. And it seemed like a great opportunity to think about the relationship between sculpture and drawing, but also to raise questions about what it is to be the kind of artist, the kind of maker that Phyllida is now, today. And we wanted to raise various questions about, kind of simple questions even, about the significance or how one can think about making now in our current circumstances. And we wanted to think in a way about how work comes into being and the significance of that, certain kinds of questions that once might have got thought about in terms of creativity, but obviously that's a very loaded term that we tend not to use. But also the very specific way in which Phyllida works, which is in response to a particular, in her sculpture, in response to a particular site or place or space. And Fiona Bradley at the Fruitmarket Gallery is in the process of working with Phyllida to make an exhibition that I think will be the international...
The Edinburgh Festival exhibition.
The Edinburgh Festival exhibition, not for this summer, but for next summer. So it seemed interesting to think about how one thinks about, I guess, process, both the process of making the work, the process of making work for an exhibition, and how that might evolve the kinds of problems, and how that, in many ways, characterises Phyllida's thinking processes. So in some ways to think about how you think about your work, but also Phyllida, as I'm sure you all know, taught for 30 years. Not quite, no. I can't count. 85. And you're
85, yes.
And you're 85. I'm 85. No, since 85.
I've taught since 1967, but I taught at the Slade from
1985.
Yes.
So in the Slade next door. So it's particularly nice to be with Phyllida here in this place. You also were studied at Chelsea and then were a student at the Slade from 1963 to 66. So again, I think we'd quite like to think about beginnings in terms of that primal scene that was the 60s as well. So without wanting to create a sort of, dogmatic structure for the discussion, it seemed a way to start anyway, which is to think about these different dimensions of beginnings, including what and how you negotiated that historical trajectory since the 60s, especially in ways that I guess, looking at your work, both the drawings and the sculpture seem so at odds with many of the, overarching tendencies as they have been described within critical and art historical commentaries. So, that's all I want to say.
Not much then to talk about.
But perhaps we can start with the Divine and the work that you've done for that very imposing space, and to think about how you thought about that. And I'm going to hand over to Fiona to ask the first question.
And obviously this is very nice for me. We're at the early stages of thinking about an exhibition with Phyllida, and it's a great treat to have the kind of conversation that we're beginning to have anyway, but here with Briony as well. It's very nice, a sort of shortcut in some ways to thinking about the show. But I wanted to start with the moment that I spoke to you in the Divines, asking a very simplistic and reductive question, saying, I was in the Divines seeing this work for the first time, and said to Phyllida, gosh, this is amazing. They're so extraordinary. You must be amazed at them as well. Saying, this will be the first time that you've seen these works in all their glory, in this extraordinary space. Are they taking you by surprise like they're taking me by surprise? And you said, no, completely not. And I thought, oh, right. Why is that? And you said, because I know them, because I drew them. I assumed you were about to say, because I have a model of the Divines and I've been moving these sculptures around my model for 6 months. And you said, no, absolutely not. I know them because I drew them. And that was fascinating to me. It might be unfair to ask you to plunge right into that between drawings, but I suppose just that, as Briony said, beginning to think about, the Fruitmarket gallery is about this big compared to the Divines, but beginning to think about however do you start to take ownership of a space such that when you put work in it, it doesn't take you by surprise. However do you do that?
Well, I think the way, two things are, although the work might have some site-specific origins, it isn't actually site-specific. What makes it have that site specificity is dimension. And the thing about the Divine was my relationship with sculpture has always been that the image of sculpture constantly dissolves and gets lost as you walk around it. That a memory of it is a very elusive thing, and you, as much as you can grasp an image of it, the image actually disappears. So I wanted to actually play with that, literally play with that throughout the Divine galleries by, in a way, putting the sculptures in a very suspended state, both literally and to some extent metaphorically. They are literally hung. And I think that idea made me very fearless about the space in a sort of arrogant way. I just took hold of the space and placed it in my head and lived with it in my head for that 18 months that the whole thing was being negotiated and prepared. So the space became something that was inhabiting me rather than me inhabiting it.
And do you do that by walking around it, by spending time in it,
yes,
by photographing it? How do you?
No, not photographing it, no, but more going there. But I didn't go there that often, actually, and I find that with spaces that I prefer to go just a few times and then use something of the sensation of it rather than the literal space itself. So the process of looking up, looking down and through, and at the time the Tate was being built and rebuilt, so it was very dark in there, and that was actually quite interesting. And it was also winter when I was making, it was dark and wintry and in a way foreboding. But I think that was like a material in itself, It was like a dark material. And so it was like, for me, it was taking hold of those things
So is it the
and
idea,
making them my own, I suppose.
is it the
rather.
idea of the space then, or the feel of the space?
The
Is it-
feel
is
of
it-
the space, both in an imaginative sense, what could be remembered from it, and also that sense of something being high and out of reach. And I think the idea of using the out of reach spaces just does fascinate me. I actually suffer from appalling vertigo. I can't even stand on a, something that's 2 inches off the ground, but it's great making other people do that for me. And I think height is something that I'm just intrigued by. The fact that there is a sort of tide mark in galleries, which is eye level, and then there's this sort of wonderful space above it, which I think other artists can use in other ways, like Alison Wilding's work before mine. Perhaps my oldest friend was in the Devine before I was, so it was very interesting. But she used that eye level sense of the space, and then the space above was a kind of weight on the sculpture, whereas I very much wanted to get up there and make sculpture be seen, certainly for myself, from underneath and at a distance. This thing of walking round sculpture as though it's a painting, I would love to make people crawl to have a look at sculpture, because I think there is a whole way of experience sculpture which doesn't necessarily just have to be an object. There are many things that are sculptural that aren't actually objects, like time and gravity, and I don't think they necessarily are just experienced through that processional way of using a gallery quite passively as a sort of promenading space.
You've talked before about gravity being one of the great materials of sculpture.
Yes.
I like that as a notion that it's important to you that these things are coming
held,
down,
yes,
held,
yeah.
but going down rather than going up. But they descend.
Yes, and they're held. I mean, the thing about the Devine, I mean, although it wasn't a surprise because of the drawings, we did make a model, and you should see the model now. It's like something that's been through an earthquake. It's been trampled on and broken and smashed to pieces just because I can't work with models. They're just too niggly and neat and too precise. And I'm not a precise person. I like approximation. I'm an approximist.
And is this
guess it.
Because you want things to be in flux and things to continue to change.
And the structural engineers didn't appreciate
I can
that
imagine.
aspect of my work at all.
I wondered about, because obviously people often, this is the sculpture gallery of Tate Britain. It's a huge space, as everybody says. There would have traditionally been a proportionate relation between the scale of sculpture and that space. And I wondered, scale is obviously hugely important in your work to its effect, but I wonder how important it is. I mean, we can say that it's huge and that has a, but I wonder
Yes, I don't think, I've said this I think scale is an illusionary thing, but I think size is a real thing, and I think I make things that are to do with what I can actually reach and make within the studio, and then they're made in many components, so very quickly they become big in size. I think in terms of scale, they bear no comparison to, say, things in a shipyard or an aircraft hangar, so it's...
Because those things don't look made by a person. Is it important to you that your works are made and therefore look made by somebody? Is the process of their making, is it important that that's sort of visually embedded?
Yes, and I find that quite a difficult thing to talk about because of this sort of the hand of the artist, the expressionist thing, and actually nearly all those works don't have my hand on it. They have me directing, almost as though the thing has a kind of stage-like performative thing about it, where the works are hugely directed, and that's quite a taxing role to have as an artist, where I'm constantly demonstrating, and then the demonstrations are then copied, and sometimes they go wrong, so we have to begin again. Hence the work taking on this kind of often quite brutalized, damaged thing as quality as well. That in a way I see as its reality rather than as an expressionist mannerism. It's actually come from quite a real source rather than, I think, as a kind of faking it source. Although I have to say I'm really interested in fakery as well.
I was thinking about the I mean, this is something that you've mentioned before, and it always really struck me, and I kept it in my head, and it came certainly to mind with the Divine, is that you're interested in making things look as if, you know, rather like a ship in a bottle. You know, how did it get there? So I guess that is about scale, in the sense that it's too big to have come in the door. So there's that sense of it being fabricated and very clearly made, but kind of the question of, you know, how's it made? How did it get there? It's almost as if it's kind of landed. And the aspect of wreckage, I suppose, that comes with that is very interesting. I mean, very much part of the effect.
And very, important to me. I mean, the idea of things elbowing their way into a space, I like very much, maybe because I see that as something that is very animal or human, is how we acquire territory for ourselves, both emotionally and psychologically, and even politically, you know. And I think, therefore, objects, to me, they're taking over our space. If this object wasn't there, it could be used by us. And I think sculpture always has that problem. It's greedy and sort of inherently obtrusive and histrionic in how it grabs the space that we might otherwise have. And I think politically that's obviously had a kind of difficult history. You know, it's been accused of all sorts of things. I actually see it as a very positive thing, that it's kind of evidence of our state of existence, you know, the way it is there,
So
uncompromisingly.
because you've made these things, we walk up the Divines in a different way. Or
Yes,
we walk
yes,
around the space in a
and
different
I
way.
would hope, which is what I was saying, God. Looks appalling.
It doesn't.
Sorry. No, but I was hoping, you know, when I'm making these, or the team is making these in the studio, I'm not actually thinking of the audience. I'm thinking of, how do I want to see this in the Divine? And then there's a hope that maybe that will be how an audience will be choreographed into.
Because you are the audience, because its relationship with a human being is ultimately, you're going to have the first relationship at that stage.
Yeah.
Rather than just because you're making it for you and you don't really want anyone else to see it. They're not private things.
No, not at all. No, these aren't,
But on the other hand, there is this sense of a lot of the titles of your earlier work, I'm thinking of Lair, Siege.
Oh, yes.
Been rather randomly drawing on, you know, that idea of almost a kind of siege mentality, or something that invokes a habitat or some kind of first structure, but is also this catastrophic kind of remainder. You know, are these shelters? Well, kind of not.
Or are they coming, or are they going, is my sort of feeling about sculpture, and also maybe about our environments. Are things on their way out or their way in, and how do we know the difference?
do you want them to be poised between the two then?
Yes.
There is that sense that they've come and they are going to go, and we just, just caught them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's what really interests me about the process of making, is a kind of place where more could happen or less could happen, you know, and that is something that perhaps I find for me, is a very compelling thing about using very ordinary materials.
Because more will happen, won't it, to these? They're not finished. These materials have not finished making meaning for
they'll
you.
probably be in the Fruitmarket
So,
in a completely new form.
so at the end of its life, as it were, it will be dismantled and recycled,
Yes,
these materials.
yes,
So
yes.
still, even though, and obviously a lot of your earlier work was dismantled
Yeah.
and therefore exists only in these photographic records.
Mm. Yes, yeah.
So
Because
the
I think,
temporality is necessarily temporary, therefore. would
yes,
you say, or?
yes, it was a very important part of beginning to sort out my relationship with sculpture and the whole way in which sculpture was taught in the 60s. I mean, not necessarily at St. Martin's, which was then quite radical, or beginning to be radical, but certainly at Chelsea. And then here was an absolute nightmare, you know, in a dark basement, being constantly told you were no bloody good, especially because you're a woman. And I know I don't want to raise all that stuff, but I mean, it was an extremely archaic regime here. And I think, but I am actually extremely grateful for the things I learnt about sculpture when sculpture was actually taught as a discipline. You know, you learnt it, you know, and you either passed it or you failed it. And I constantly failed it until I came across clay and plaster. And I think that's because they were very close to a kind of immediate gestural way of working. And they had their own life, which I had to compete with in terms of making.
Is it a no tools thing? Do you
Yes,
do you
absolutely.
work with your hands?
Well, actually, the clay, both Elizabeth Frink, and George Foulard both said, don't touch the clay. And they would quote Germaine Richier, who said, clay is a hysterical medium. The more, the more you touch it, the more it screams. And I think, I mean, that just made an incredible impression on me, that you could actually just do a swipe.
Yeah,
And if
let's
you
make
look
it
at her
scream.
work, you can see it in those, you know, well, the Tate has got those amazing orage, yeah.
And were you interested in Richier at that?
Oh, God, yes,
And-
yes.
And
yeah.
at the end of the 60s, I think, you encountered Eva Hesse's work?
Yes.
Or was it earlier?
65. They showed me, I saw the, somehow I saw she was in Germany then, wasn't it? So it was the works that were on at Hauser and Wirth that
So
I
you
saw.
actually saw them in some...
No, I saw them as actually black and white images, which sounds extraordinary, you know. Yeah. But yes, yeah. So began to get to know that there was something that was extremely non-British, and I just fell upon it because it was like being offered a new territory of exploration, that you could throw things, you could tie things. There wasn't a morality. I think it was the morality about making that I was very early on beginning to find absolutely intolerable.
That it shouldn't be seen, the making. That
it shouldn't be seen, or if it was going to be seen, it would be seen in a very specific kind of way, like through the skill of the bronze casting, or the cheese grater marks of Henry Moore were a real sort of issue. But in order to get to that point, you had to be able to carve, and you had to be able to do all these other things that were to do with making sculpture. So I think sculpture was very much about a craft process, and then looking at Eva Hesse and then seeing the arte povera artists emerge, you know, Manzoni and people. It was just like, oh my God, you know, there is another way about thinking about what an object is and what the status of an object is, you know.
I'm really interested in that moment, partly because, you know, it seemed like a moment when we might retrospectively think of the sabotage of the art object, you know, and the thinness of it, in you know, that moment of conceptualism in the later 60s, as much here as elsewhere. And you know, there is this moment for Eva Hesse when, after this year in Germany, where she's making these highly coloured reliefs that were shown at Hauser & Wirth last year, a lot of them. You know, she goes back to New York and she finds sculpture and she abandons colour. You know, and
she has that incredible correspondence with Sol LeWitt about whiteness, isn't it? That is right, isn't it? I just thought that was absolutely fantastic that discussion, you know.
And that kind of necessity to, in some way, you know, in a way, as Bochner says, to do something akin to what's happening within conceptualism and the sabotage of the object, but to do it through sculpture. And yet when you, I know that the timescale is not exactly the same or exactly parallel, but there's a way in which your various moves early in your working life and the work that you were making absolutely never abandons colour. Well, I suppose they're the drawings in the show at the gallery where they suddenly become monochrome, the drawings of the 70s. But the way in which, you know, colour functions for you with sculpture as opposed to kind of against it, or is this, you know, there's some kind of antagonism or battling out between painting and sculpture. In the drawings, perhaps, some of that is also being seen. But it's a very different response to that, you know, the problematizing of the relationship between painting and sculpture that we might think about in the US context, for instance, in the middle of the 60s. And it seems that colour and sculpture, as well as abstraction and figuration in a way, from the beginning never were entirely incompatible, oppositional elements. And that now seems very timely, of course, but at the time must have been really out of kilter with what other people were doing.
Not in terms of the New Generation show in '65, where, you know, Philip King, etc., etc. He showed Genghis Khan and tra-la-la. So there was that explosion of
colour in
sculpture with colour, and God, what's his name? Not David Annesley, who did the very flat, bent sculptures in that. No one was alive then, so me.
Well, just not them.
Yeah, but there was this one artist whose name I can't remember because I'm senile. That were just flat, bent pieces of steel that were painted, so they were about as close as you could get to a painted.
Or Cairo, obviously.
Yes. David Smith. Not David Smith. No. British artist, like, it'll come to me. I don't think about it, I'll remember.
But for you, it's because colour in the drawings, as Briony says, there's the black and white moments, but the early, very, very highly coloured drawings.
Yes.
Are they to do with that kind of sculpture? Is the drawing somewhere where colour started to be something you
I
could
think
work
the
with?
colour has always been about trying to emphasise and trying to differentiate between one edge and another, you know, whereas I found the pencil, although fantastic, it didn't do enough for me, and so the colour and the way of painting has always been, in a way, quite practical and expedient. It's been about trying to state that this is where this begins.
Oh, right. So and this is here and this is here.
Yes,
and this
exactly.
is how you'd walk around it if it was an object.
Absolutely. Yes, yeah. And it also comes from maybe being very, you know, just being absolutely fascinated by early, you know, colour sculpture from the early part of the 20th century, and wondering where that sort of went to in the sort of black hole of the 20th century. I mean, I think there was, you know, the Second World War obviously sort of obliterated a lot in a funny kind of way, and it had to kind of reinvent itself, which it did in the 60s, and rediscovered some of the things that had been.
You mentioned the Picasso, the painted
glass of absinthe.
But in a way, I guess, I mean, I take the point that Philip King, Cairo, there were, you know, coloured sculpture was there, but I guess it's something about painterly colour maybe that your work has, I don't know whether you would call it painterly, but it's not the kind of colour that in a Cairo or in a Philip King, even though one of the drawings in the gallery almost has the kind of Philip King in there. But it's something maybe about the painterly, maybe something about painting and sculpture. It seems like a kind of elephant in the room to me, because you don't want to. These are not paintings. These are drawings. They're on paper. But the stroke or something about the tactility. I mean, would that associate with a kind of bodily engagement with colour?
I think it's also trying to, we talked a bit about the order in which you sort of see things and name things. Yes. I mean, is this a table before one sees it as a fake wood table or a yellow table or whatever colour, you know, how do we create that order in our heads about things? And I think for me, colour was very much about trying to almost compete with the form, because the formal qualities of things is what I've loved. That's where a sort of passion is, you know, the roundedness of something, or the straightness of something, or the fallen overness of something. But then the colour, in a way, is almost competing with that for in a hierarchical sense.
Or does colour help us see that? If we're looking at a sculpture of yours, does the colour sort of confuse the bit of our brain that wants it to resolve itself into a table or a structure? The colour actually makes it look like a round thing or a falling over thing, rather than something we might recognise somewhere else.
It's a bit like a pointing device.
So is it doing the same thing that it's doing in the drawings? It's like, look at this bit and then look at that bit.
Yes, that's how I see it. So also I'm not afraid. I don't find it problematic that maybe sometimes the surfaces and the colour is almost akin to decoration, even though it might be a smear or a smudge, but it's an additive thing, so that it's surplus to requirement in a way. But to me, it's actually emphasising something, and that's what the colour is doing.
Because we talked earlier about the kinds of colours. Briony mentioned the kinds of colours you used, and you said you use colours that draw attention to themselves, that are attention-seeking.
Yes.
Which I love the idea that a sculpture should be attention-seeking.
Because I think it is. Do
you think it inevitably is, so you might as well go with it?
I think it's inevitably theatrical, I think it's it is, as Germaine Richier said, I think it's quite a hysterical art form, both in terms of hysterically funny, but also hysterically tragic, you know, because I don't know, I think a lot of sculpture is there to be walked past. It just, in a very peculiar way, becomes invisible. I'm thinking of the Serra in Broadgate, you know, which almost disappears into the environment. And I think, you know, certainly public sculpture can do that extraordinary thing of becoming as invisible as anything else on the street becomes invisible until you fall over it or something, or it bumps into.
And then you realise how absurd it is that we live with all these sculptural objects, the bollards, the street furniture, and we don't notice them as objects any more than we notice a great big Serra, or in our case in Edinburgh, two very large giraffes that I walk past every day.
I also wonder, whether painting, because it occupies, I know this is a very traditional, conventional view of painting, but because it occupies the wall space, there's somehow a formality there that's very specific. Walls to me are the signature of authority in terms of architecture and buildings, whereas I think floors are more, in a way, they're absolutely essential, in a way. But they are more ambiguous in how they can be used and filled. But walls definitely are dividing spaces and controlling spaces in terms of how you move around a building. But in terms of art, they're traditionally the space that's known to be for paintings. Whereas sculpture, I think, it's like the Royal Academy hangs there, looking around nervously to see. But I mean, it's like parking a Caro as though it's a sofa in the corner of a room. And I find that sort of way of trying to keep sculpture out of the way, it's actually really interesting, because I think that floor space is potentially, in my mind, an anarchic space. You know, it's a space occupied by people and other things that can interrupt people. But the wall space is actually, this isn't a reflection on what but it's a much safer space in a way for where art can go.
Do you, I mean, there is the sense that you're using the space that the architectural frame and gives you, but you seem to bring, in terms of a lot of the things that have maybe inspired you visually over the years, the kind of mess or chaos of the street, like skips, or in some of the drawings there are the what seems resonant of those orange plastic sheets that, you know, shroud scaffolding, or you talked about pink in terms of, you know, the colour of kind of street signs, and all this kind of bringing the outside into the inside in a way, and messing up those borders. But it seemed that as it were, the life of the street and the way in which boulders or bollards or barriers, they're often things that stop you moving around. I mean, is that again what you think sculpture is, like some sort of big bollard?
Yes, I suppose it's obstinacy. I mean, I think are the two things, is the sculptural language, and is sculptural language far more, I was going to use the word diffuse in the sense that maybe weather can be sculptural, in the sense that it can affect us physically, whereas a sculptural object is far more specific. And I think it's the sculptural language that I'm interested in how things take us over or control us in all sorts of ways, as well as objects. I mean, they obviously fascinate me, but I think there are certain things that accompany those objects that are, in a way, about decision making. Why do we have to cross the road here? You know, what is that doing there? How is it that that building's gone up and no one knows how the hell it got decided? You know, these things that are underlying the sort of decision makings about objects, which I think sculpture has that problem. Therefore, the sculptural object on the street that's just an everyday thing fascinates me, because it's so loaded if you begin to unravel it. And then there's things that have a mood, like the weather, that I see also as very sculptural, but more about a language of sculpture. I don't know if that makes any sense. I think there's a sort of differentiation.
I was going to ask you about control. Your objects seem somehow to have an agency of their own. You talk about street furniture, and that clearly has an agency. We do what we're told by objects.
Yes, exactly.
The fact that people have made those objects,
Yeah.
but it now seems to be the objects telling us what to do. We cross on the zebra crossing. The black and white lines tell us to do that.
Yes.
But I wonder, do you like to keep in control of your objects?
No.
No.
No, I like to, although I think it's hell, I think that kind of losing control, which is sort of what I'm in the middle of now with the next show. Sorry to break it to you, but that kind of losing control is, especially if you're working with a team of people, so it's almost like a collaboration. So it is like being in the middle of directing something and suddenly nobody knows what the script is.
Because the object is taking over. The object has its
it's
own
taking
rules,
over, and in a way that is possibly not what anyone expected. And so that's quite difficult. It's whether it, at that point, I probably don't know whether it's working or not.
But is that the point that you always have to get to?
Yes,
point
I
where
think
all
I
is
do.
about to fall apart.
I think that's what was, in a way, the difficulty with the Devine on working on that at that height and on that scale, and that's why it wasn't a surprise when it all went in there, because so much of it had been kind of worked through in some form or other, almost like a rehearsal. And then we couldn't actually see any of the work in its entirety, but there were plenty of rehearsals about how things went together. So when the performance came, there wasn't that surprise, because there had been those rehearsals.
In terms of bravery and fear and success and failure, is it a sense that the work has already failed, so it doesn't? It can be free to fail again if that's what it's going to do. Is part of the success of the work?
Yes, I love that. I mean, I love failure. I think it's a fantastic place to inhabit, and I think the word, I sort of hate the word success, and it's bandied around, isn't it? Children are expected to be successful, and I think.
Well, first we want them to be happy, then we want them to be successful, isn't it? And then we think they're linked somehow.
I mean, I don't mean to be like a miserablist, but I think why not enjoy something about failure, because it is a sort of freedom, to be able to do that. And the Tate gave that opportunity, which I think is an incredible courage on their part.
Courage on theirs, but not on yours. You talked about not being brave.
No, I'm not brave at all. I mean, I think I'm just doing what I've always done, and I don't see myself as, I think you have to, as an artist, you have to sort of occasionally, well, not occasionally, a lot see it from the curator's point of view, that they're taking as many risks as you are as an artist, and that's quite an interesting symbiotic relationship.
I suppose so, and maybe the audience is taking the biggest risk of all, coming in and trusting that they're being manipulated by the artist around this object, and they're going to get something out of it. Yeah. Do you care about the audience? Do you care about the visitor? Or is it all about, she says this sounds terrible, is it all about you? I don't mean that. That you don't care about the audience, but can you bear to think about the audience when you're thinking things up, when you're thinking about how you're going to make something?
I find it intensely irritating having to think. I mean, I don't know at what moment you're meant to, as an artist, think about the audience, and I certainly can't think about the audience when I'm producing the work and the work is in production.
Well,
but I think the minute it hits that space and it's all in pieces, and there's this incredible energy, driving energy to get it to perform, because that's what is being asked, then gradually this sense of audience begins to grow. What was incredible was setting up the Devine works with no, it was very open, so I could hear what the public were thinking, and And that was quite amazing, listening to their comments, you know, and
Did they think you were the scaffolder putting the?
yeah, I don't know what they thought. Yes, yeah. But you know, you could lean on the metal barriers and you could just hear people's passing comments, and it's very revealing.
It's a whole new dimension to the idea of work as performative, isn't it? We've talked about it having time and actions embedded in it and being something, but I guess it's never meant to be a sort of public performance. The work.
But it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Before we open it up to discussion, I wanted, with the audience, I wanted to broach one last issue, which I guess relates to the fact that you said you've been doing this a very long time, and it's become very visible to us. You know, you've had a suite of really extraordinary exhibitions, including these. But it's really that question that we I think are all interested in, which is, you know, what is the significance now of the kind of artist that you are? You know, and you've spoken very eloquently about a sculptural vocabulary, and that sense that, you know, your sense of making work comes out of this, you know, trajectory that began in the 60s, and obviously you've been making work throughout, but it's come to a much greater public visibility, not that it wasn't before. And that, you know, we were thinking about the significance of, you know, making in, you know, the kind of stuff of art, what I referred to before as, you know, the smell of the studio that your work certainly has, and how you see that yourself, you know, what it is about making, what it is about having this very physical relationship with the work. Why, in the context of our current conditions, when in a way we inhabit this, you know, an image culture, or saturated by images, and yet you in your work, I think I was kind of getting the feeling that you want your work to in some way antagonise the image, you know, that you're not a producer of images in some way. And I wonder why that might be interesting now. I mean, that's... I
can't, I would be, I don't know how to, for starts at that, yes, the rejection of the image, I think, is incredibly difficult to do, but that's where I begin my work. When I want to make something, I very often don't know what the hell it is I want to make. I just have the impulse to make. And I think that this is an incredibly difficult position to advocate, because it doesn't have a subject and it doesn't have meaning in the sense that I think is more and more a kind of necessity of art. I don't know where it's come from, but it seems to be. It's just like a bodily function. And so often the works might begin with just mixing materials or picking materials up or using things that are lying around in the studio and just literally playing around with them and seeing whether that then leads somewhere. Now, I don't find that a very convincing thing to be telling people. It doesn't ring true in some way, but it's just the way it is for me, you know, and it is a question of what is this going to become? And I think that sense of something becoming something is what intrigues me. But I don't have a subject. I have lots of references about damage and reparation and regeneration, a kind of cycle of decay and regeneration. That fascinates me because maybe that's what my generation has witnessed, you know, seen London sort of in ruins and then seen it come up and then fall down again. It's just a constantly changing thing, and it's the same with nature. It's part of us, that cycle. Therefore, for me, something about making is the same process, a constant state of change. But I think the idea of beginning something with great clarity is not the most interesting way for me to begin. I sort of long for it because I think it would make life easier, but it's not the way I make things. I don't know. I mean, I think I'm an incredibly traditional, ordinary artist in that respect, and therefore I don't know whether it has any interest for anyone at all in the current climate. So that's my response.
But perhaps the return of that kind of intense materiality, or watching something make itself and unmake itself, which is, I think, one of the interesting aspects of your work. It might relate in odd and curious ways to other work that is getting made that might take different forms.
Absolutely,
And
yes.
I find it quite interesting that although you come from such a sculptural base, so much to do with the medium, that in many ways perhaps we might think of your work in relationship to the work of other artists that actually is in entirely different media, and it's actually something more structural, or something about a necessity for a kind of resist, or it's certainly a kind of very strange materials and temporalities that you present us with that fail to fit what we think we know, and certainly what we are being told about the world that we inhabit. So even its kind of belonging to a time of sculpture almost cuts against the grain of you know, the on message.
Yes, absolutely. I think
sense of what art is meant to do.
I think there was a time, and when that idea of talking about sculpture was almost sort of banned in some way. You know, it was sculpture just wasn't within the vocabulary of fine art.
No.
It was just fine art, and I'm okay with that from a sort of educational point of view, but I'm not okay with it for myself. I would never inflict sculpture on my worst enemies. I mean, I hate it and love it in equal doses, and I think its history is dire, you know, often. I mean, I think there's a whole classification of sculpture, maybe Briony as an example, where I think it's more about painting than sculpture, etc., etc., etc. So the history for me is wobbly, you know.
I think for me, what you said there, Briony, about objects which happen in front of you, which are there in the space with you, are very much, you know, whether I don't know, the notion of things coming in and out of fashion in art, or in and out of, you know, we talked earlier about tropes and the notion of being on message, and what you're talking about, certainly running a gallery and looking at audiences looking at art, things which happen in the gallery, things which happen right there in front of you, where there is the maker or the audience, I think have a currency and a primacy to them, which is certainly what, in my experience, young artists making things now want to look at, and audiences looking at things now want to look at, and they are, it seems to me that your work is absolutely, whether it's riding some kind of zeitgeist or whatever, but it's absolutely of this moment where we want objects to come out and get us and help us understand other things, help us navigate the world as we navigate our way around your sculpture. So we're going to go out there and navigate everything else, and maybe there is something
I think
about
that's
this
sort of interesting in the sense that, in a way, sculpture, despite its sort of brutal reality, is probably the most fake of all the arts, because it isn't the thing that you then encounter, if you like, for real in the world that thing has reminded you of or has prompted you to.
Except that it totally is, because we navigate our way around stuff all the time.
Yes, exactly, but because it's framed by a gallery or a space or whatever it is, it's sort of on stage. And I know I've talked about this before, but I've never really understood that phrase, what is it, when you go to the theatre, you suspend
Oh, yes.
disbelief. Suspend disbelief, is it, or do you just suspend belief? I
think it's disbelief. I'm not sure.
Disbelief.
I never can quite tell what the difference is between suspending disbelief and suspending belief, because they sort of end up in the same place. And to me, sculpture has that trickery about it.
Really
I mean, a
nice.
bronze is an extraordinary thing
Yeah.
because it's just a skin with a great big black hollow hole in the middle. So it's pretending.
But it's a real thing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. It's really nice.
Mm.
What about if we, I think if we
Yes.
open it
Yes.
up to the audience and any comments, questions from you? I know there are a lot of people in the audience who... Yes.
I have a question about your commission of the Duveen Galleries. As I know, they just recently went through renovation, so I wanted to know if in that renovation there was in mind already of your commission being there, or if the space was what kind of made you create the form of your sculpture, if that makes sense.
I don't know if they had that in mind with the renovation. I just took it as a sort of straight invitation and responded as directly as I could to it, with also there was a proviso to think of the history of the Duveen. And because I've sort of known that space since the 1950s, and I can recall quite significant shows there, especially sculpture. Although there was a Miro show, I mean, there have been lots of fantastic painting shows there. I think it's the sculpture so that idea of how you use that space as a promenading space to walk around sculpture was very much a trigger to it. So the renovation didn't really affect me, if that answers your question. Do you mean the fact that the work looks so sort of damaged and that had something to do with it?
No, well, I was just thinking in the sense that when MoMA reopened back in 2008, they had in mind the Richard Serra show, that they were going to bring in those sculptures. So, you know, how you were saying that, like, how did it get in there? You know, so that's why I was just wondering if, you know, kind of more other aspects besides kind of the artistic process that kind of came into mind when creating the work.
I think it was more, it was sort of quite simple, if you know what I mean. It was very much about the here and now, to take it on and let that space inhabit me, and also bring to it something of my memory of discovering sculpture in there. If that,
no,
makes
definitely.
Francis.
I just, it's a follow-up question really. I've always thought that you're incredibly generous about what you might call your influences, and so many artists refuse to talk about other artists or don't want to see their work in the context of its time, at whatever time they're making the work. And I just wondered in relation to that whether, because the Duveens, you referred to the memory of other projects in those spaces, and I mean, for all of us who've visited those spaces over the years, they're kind of haunted by installation. You can almost see the marks where you know,
the Serra
was installed, and I love that kind of patina of age, and sort of, you know, kissing the hand of history. But more than that, I wondered whether, as a British artist who's taught sculpture over a long period of time, who's, you know, you're very knowledgeable about your peers and the antecedents, whether that was particularly special for you or meaningful, or whether it inflected the work in any way to be at the centre of this trajectory of the history of art, which you're kind of surrounded by this chronological, slow history unfolding. And, you know, there is Anthony Caro's, you can see it through the door. Whether the work seemed to me, maybe I was reading too much into it, but it seems to me there was a sort of secret history unfolding.
Oh yeah, there was, absolutely. I mean,
deeply inflected.
Yeah, the sort of the Caro thing was very fortuitous in that it was on the right, if you're going down, of where the big panel sculpture was, and it was quite inspirational because it was there from quite early on when I was planning for the Duveen, and it seemed like a sort of landmark in a way use, if that isn't being too insulting to him. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to, you know, I'm not making a sort of facetious comment about those other artists, but there are things like invented form, which has become, or I think had a kind of rocky history, you know, bad history is seen as sort of the ultimate thing to achieve as a sculptor, you know, the sort of form that's all writhing and twisted. And so that interested me, and that's very much in that hanging white plaster one. And there are these constant references the whole time. There's the sort of damaged containers. These obviously to me refer to kind of minimalism, and you know, so that yes, yeah.
Well, they are like the Sarah, aren't they? Hoisted up.
Well, yes. I mean, that it is a kind of potted history of.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant.
But at the same time, there's something so extraordinarily kind of contrary about the materials that you're using, the sense of the ephemeral and the mobilization of the ugly and the wasted and the industrial and all those things. So you have the sense of that tradition, but at the same time you have this extraordinary feeling that it's imploding in front of your eyes. And I think that that's what for me was so kind of wonderful and rich about it. And I mean, especially those big minimalist like blocks, which where you actually see the styrofoam or whatever it is, and you want to go and break off a piece.
You can.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, you can't. Neil and I were touching it and trying
I'm fine with that. But no, I mean, they're made out. Yes. Sorry.
Curator says no.
But that's what I was meaning about. If a Judd or a Robert Morris is the real thing, then these are pretend versions there. And Briony was talking about amateurism earlier on. These are almost like the amateur versions, and that's why if they get knocked, and one has been knocked, and it's got this sort of graze on one side, but I like that. They were made with that in mind, because they are made out of these non-lasting materials that kind of pastiche. They're a shadow play of the versions that they came from, and because I've loved that work so passionately, and it is a passion, you know, it's been something of trying to absorb that into the divine.
So do you think in a way there's a sense of history in relation to the work, or embedded in the work, that both, you know, it does have associations with a kind of industrial, post-industrial kind of, you know, the structures that are kind of very familiar, these scaffoldings and the wreckage that we encounter, but also that necessarily involves looking at the history of sculpture, you know, that part of what the work does is to reflect on the history of sculpture, especially since the 60s, and, you know, that whole trajectory from minimalism.
And I think before, I mean, I'm actually very interested in that dark, heavy time between 1940 and then 59, you know, where especially in France, where you get this incredibly, I mean, morbid, and understandably so. The country had just been, you know, devastated, and so those sculptors, César, Etienne Martin, I mean, there's who aren't big names now, but I think there is some incredibly powerful but ugly,
kind of
ugly as sin
blighted
sculpture.
forms.
Nobody else, I mean, people don't like it, you know, because it has none of that contemporary, imageful resilience, you know, it's uncomfortable.
Do you seek out the ugly? Do you like?
Yes, I
ugly
do.
things?
I'm especially in terms of
looking at other sculpture.
There was a lecture series at the AA, the Architectural Association, by Mark Cousins, and he said the ugly has no history, and I thought, you know, beauty does, and I thought it was such a brilliant statement.
A brilliant series.
Yes, yeah.
Any other
This is a very simple question. In terms of the smell of the studio, as you referred, that I think everyone can tell. What is your relation with sound?
Good question.
Which composer is more close to you, and how do you?
Which composers are?
Composer.
Would I?
Maybe this is a very specific and is your personal. But what is your relation? Your work? How is it related with sound and music?
Yes, I mean, all my assistants play the most incredible range of, resonant, what's it called? That radio program. And I don't know. And my children, we live in a house which has got 4 stories, and the 5 children would each occupy different floor with different music going on in it. But I would have Got a Dammerung belting out full blast, and Mahler's Third, and the complete unaccompanied cello. I mean, I love very conventional. I love classical music, and especially contemporary classical music. So, yes, it means a lot to me, music. But it's I'm embarrassed to talk about it, actually.
Alex.
Yes.
Oh, hi.
Just to pick up, what I see to be a number of questions are sort of circulated around this point of your referencing a kind of richness of a sculptural tradition, but also kind of refusing it as well and going in a different way. Because a phrase you use, which I kind of responded to quite strongly, is you use the idea of a language of sculpture, and of course the first title that comes to mind is old William Tucker in his Language of Sculpture, and it seems to me you're not, you're not denying that, but you're doing something very different. And I thought, as I saw these slides going by, and I saw Dot behind barriers the day before it was open, because I happened to be able to get there then. So I think it's a totally amazing piece, and I think it sort of makes one think about the language of sculpture, because there's all these attempts to formulate it, and I think Tucker is one of them. I think Ros Kraus came up with another alternative sort of minimalist sort of conceptual language of sculpture. And it strikes me that what's so interesting about your work is that you kind of, you reference that, but you do something very different, which really makes one think, what could a language of sculpture be? What would be a more generous understanding of it? So you didn't just think of it in terms of construction or modeling or whatever. And I suppose in the end one's just left with this rather kind of puzzling sense, though I would say one thing that I felt you would be, that you're kind of slightly the opposite of, is what some of the students were reacting against at St. Martin's. I don't think it was Cairo as such, but this idea of the perfectly balanced, perfectly fabricated, welded metal sculpture, which was somehow absolutely precisely itself. That seems to be a sense of sculpture that you don't want.
No, I mean, I find perfection. I mean, perfection, I think, is a really interesting subject, because I think it's had an extraordinary trajectory since the late 80s. And I don't know, I always felt, and it may be wrongly, that perfectionism in that sense, from the Cairo era, how well could you weld, was very different from its reincarnation later on, where it seemed actually a direct, and people might think I'm bonkers saying this, a direct relationship with Thatcherism, actually. The sort of perfectly gleaming, crafted object. And I actually love Jeff Koons' work, so it's not a direct hit at him, but there is that status of the object that's been manufactured elsewhere that is then falls into the perfect space that is a sort of phenomena. It's got a phenomenological quality about it, and I'm intrigued by it, but it's not. I don't know how to. I wouldn't know how to adopt that. I'm just in awe of it, and in awe now of what I think is quite a considerable history of it, a sort of 30-year history, where I think it was born out of a right-wing, both a right-wing economy and a right-wing philosophy, oddly enough. And I think the rest is history, as one says, yeah.
Yes.
Phyllida, can I ask you a question about being a woman in art? The odds seem stacked against women being recognised by the sort of national institutions. Very few women are represented in our big galleries, and it appears to me that you've got phenomenally successful as you've got older, and you've reached this sort of period of your life where suddenly you're in these great galleries and everyone knows who you are, and it's happened perhaps at maybe an unexpected time of your life, not right at the beginning, but perhaps more towards the end. And I wonder how you achieved this greatness later in life, and I wondered if that had affected you, affected your work, and I wonder if you had any comment on that for any younger women artists in the room, and how you would approach being a woman in an art world.
First of all, can anyone define the art world? I wonder how you might define it. I'm not just trying to be provocative to you, but I don't know what the art world is.
Recognition of being a successful female artist.
But I wouldn't have wanted what I've got now I think being a teacher in an art school for ever since 1967 is a very mixed, it's quite a lazy way of being an artist, actually, because the minute you are being funded, there was a time when art schools were patrons to artists. That's changed, and it's a kind of quite a deadly activity now. You know, you're expected to be accounted for in every possible way, and you're doing much more than what you are paid to do. You know, it's a cutthroat business. But I think early on in the more sort of philanthropic time, you were paid just to be the artist coming in, and what defined you as an artist is whatever you wanted to say defined you as an artist. So that sort of woolly grey area was very vibrant for a very, very short amount of time, possibly as little as 5 years. And then people started getting full-time jobs and falling to sleep in art schools. And then of course it laid art schools wide open to being cross-examined, you know. But I think for me it meant that I didn't have to face the reality of having to survive from my work, but enabled me to be constantly on the move with it and constantly challenging it and having a very, very restless relationship with it, which I value enormously. And by chance, things changed when I retired. So it was a most peculiar and fortuitous turn of events. But I don't think I would have wanted, I value that 40 years of trying things out and keeping going in that way. And I think there is very little advice to give to either male or female artists other than just, for God's sake, keep going, you know. I mean, is that really incredibly unhelpful? Sorry.
Well, it's clearly your truth, so that's important. So
I mean, is there really that much? I mean, of course I'm a de facto feminist, but is there really that much? Do people all feel that the galleries seem to be full of female artists at the moment, or have been?
Perhaps the National Gallery or some of our more established institutions, there's a definite lack of women represented through the ages.
Yeah, but that's going to change.
I hope so.
It is. There are more women in the art world than ever.
Thank those. Yes.
I'm just thinking it's funny for me, you know, when you say it's like like a pretending sculptor or something. So, and then he talks about how you wouldn't have wanted to have this career earlier. How does it feel when I say to you, like, I've just been studying art, and most of my peers and I will go, and when we see your work, it's like worship. So you do have that awe almost around it, but it's great because then when you talk about it, you talk about the absurdity of sculpture and how things are, like, you talk about things in this hilarious way sometimes, and it gives you that freedom to, like, really, I don't know, have that awe, but then also in the work itself, but then also to realise that things are attainable somehow and that you can have this new language developing. But I just wonder how you feel about the awe, because I imagine you'd be incredibly uncomfortable.
Don't be in awe. Please, I mean, I'm the most ordinary person with chaotic family life, things falling apart. Well, you've seen what my home, nothing's clean, it's disgusting, you know. I mean, I love ordinariness. That's all I really want, is something completely ordinary.
That's
You
what
know.
makes you awesome.
Oh. No, I want something really extraordinary. No, I don't think there's anything. I mean, don't forget the art world is so, whatever that is. I mean, I think it's an illusion and a mirage. But here today, gone tomorrow, you know, give it another couple of years and I will be back in a hovel in Finsbury Park making work that nobody sees. I think there's something hugely amazing to be under the radar, and you're watching. I mean, I know that Plato's cave thing is done to death, but it is almost like you're watching these shadows of. I mean, I could fire off names from the 60s, and I would be amazed if any of you heard of them, and yet they were the absolute sort of signature artists of that time. So I think don't believe anything too much, you know.
I think it's interesting, this idea of work being under the radar. Not that you weren't producing what I think for many of us, you know, through those years, filtered down and was kind of very significant, but it wasn't going to be prominently displayed in major institutions. But there's a sense in which maybe the belatedness of your career in its most public dimension is kind of interesting to me as almost a kind of revision or thinking over those decades, because you do have this very particular, maybe idiosyncratic, you know, I don't mean entirely individualistic, but a way of bringing together almost incompatible kind of models of sculpture within sculpture, you know, to bring the abstract together with the figurative. In these drawings, there's sort of, you know, I don't know, a splodge of colour, but there's a shadow, so it becomes a token of something, you know, something that's so solid and palpable and in the world. And there's that sense that you retrospectively almost, you know, in the drawings from the 80s, seem to give us a slightly alternative, you know, destiny for sculpture, because it seems to be that you did allow kind of the category of sculpture to carry on when in fact it did become below the threshold, or, you know, under the radar of where the most kind of vanguard art might be, and that actually has enabled it to kind of get this real head of critical steam that now seems to, you know, have this kind of resonance with not only audiences but with something that's going on, that's somehow an imperative of some kind that revolves around making but isn't reducible to it.
I think that's, if I've ever had to need courage, it was the needing courage to actually try and hold on to sculpture as a subject within the proliferation towards fine art as a generalized, and a lot of people would think that was a waste of time and not good education, but I still felt there were things about some of these, you know, things like casting that was so phenomenologically wonderful that it didn't matter whether you were a painter or a filmmaker. In fact, I think casting has a terrific amount to do with film and photography and things and printmaking. So to me, there wasn't this kind of isolationist idea of sculpture. but the fact that it was incredibly connected to all these other ways of thinking about producing something from your imagination into the world.
Well, thank you, Phyllida.
Thank you.
I think we're going to
Thank
draw
you.
it to a close. Thank you very much,
Yes.
Fiona. Thank you,
Thank
Phyllida.
you.
Thank you.